You know, we began our season examining the social and political upheaval that led to the Civil War in December. We looked at the lives of women in the field of combat in January, the impact of the Civil War on American Indians, particularly here in Minnesota. And today we explore the tumultuous Reconstruction era, which often puts me in mind of Alice in Wonderland and that quote about believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. It was probably one of the wildest and woolliest periods in American history. And today we will consider the struggles that erupted over citizenship and freedom in the Civil War's aftermath during that time. Before the war, at the landmark 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, Frederick Douglass helped Elizabeth Cady Stanton convince delegates to support the then strange concept of women's suffrage. During the war, Stanton and her fellow women's rights advocates petitioned for abolition via constitutional amendment. However, during Reconstruction, these allies came to a parting of the ways as their causes, black male and women's suffrage, became competitors. The divide that opened between Stanton and Douglass reflected a larger schism between the civil rights and women's rights movements. So how did these two causes, so long allied, come to such a terrible rift? Well, she came through 3 airports to tell you. Faye Dudden is a professor of history and a presidential scholar at Colgate University. She is the author of A Fighting Chance, The Struggle Over Women's Suffrage and Black Suffrage in Reconstruction. Dudden has received fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She chairs the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Book Prize Committee and is the winner of the George Freedley Memorial Prize given for exceptional historical scholarship. Please welcome her.
Thank you so much for that nice welcome. I'm awfully pleased to be here for a couple of reasons. And I'm really pleased that I didn't make you wait an extra half hour before I could start. So without further ado, by destroying slavery, the Civil War inevitably raised the question, what are the rights of free people? And neither the Constitution nor the courts could answer that question adequately. The question of voting rights, what they called suffrage, was especially urgent, and reluctant politicians had to grapple with it, while activists from previously excluded groups, including blacks and women, stepped forward to press their claims. In the upshot, black men won the ballot. By 1870, their right to vote was protected by the 15th Amendment. But it would be 50 years before women's suffrage achieved the same result in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. That difference in outcome led to one of the most famous episodes in all of American women's history, an episode in which the revered founding mothers, if I may call them that, of the American women's rights movement disgraced themselves. Talking about these women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They're pretty well known to Americans. I think Anthony maybe a little more because they put her on the dollar. But Stanton and her particular role as a pioneer at Seneca Falls has come to the fore. Seneca Falls was actually mentioned in the inaugural address this year, which I think means we're getting somewhere in terms of public consciousness. This is Stanton as a younger woman, when probably about the time of the Seneca Falls Convention. And as Danielle mentioned, she was the one who wrote the Declaration of Sentiments there, in which they figured out the best way to claim rights was to appropriate the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, was what they said at Seneca Falls. And as Danielle mentioned, when Stanton proposed the most radical proposal, which was to claim the ballot, Frederick Douglass was there. He had come down from Rochester to support her and convince the attendees at the conference, of the convention, I should say, to pass that measure. Susan B. Anthony, as a younger woman, she was not at Seneca Falls. She was working as a school teacher and became aware that male teachers were paid about 3 times what women were, and began to gravitate toward the women's movement. Both Anthony and Stanton were also active in the abolitionist movement. And that gave them both a bit of an education in the fine art of doing things that most people disapprove of and not being cowed by that social stigma, because abolitionists were stigmatized. This is a picture that comes from the period we're talking about now, the period of the late 1860s, the subject of my talk. And I think you'll agree that there's a certain way in which their expressions here appear to indicate something like, "we mean business." That's my subject today. In February 1869, Elizabeth Cady Stanton warned that if the nation gives the vote to black men but not to women, it will encourage fearful outrages on womanhood, especially in the southern states. Fearful outrages. This is a 19th century euphemism for rape. She was predicting that if black men had the vote, it would empower them as rapists. Disgrace. She said that if the 15th Amendment was passed, persecutions, insults, and horrors would descend upon women. This was published in Stanton and Anthony's newspaper, The Revolution. 3 months later, at the meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, Stanton and Anthony famously crossed swords with the great black leader of the day, Frederick Douglass, about whether to support the 15th Amendment. Douglass thundered, "When women, because they are women, are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, only then will women have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own." But Stanton and Anthony refused to support the 15th Amendment, and Stanton sneered about Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Yung Tung presuming to make laws for the daughters of Adams and Jefferson. The upshot of this nasty rhetoric was an acrimonious divorce between the advocates of black rights and women's rights, activists who had been longtime allies dating back to their movement's origin in the antebellum years. Now, although this episode is among the most famous in U.S. women's history, historians still have difficulty accounting for it. For a long time, it was ignored or soft-pedaled by admiring biographers, but that's no longer possible. More recently, young scholars have taken the opposite tack, and they've written off Stanton and Anthony and sometimes the whole women's movement as fundamentally racist. But slapping a label on them, however richly deserved, doesn't explain how they got there, because they weren't this bad in earlier years. Some historians solve the problem by focusing not on the cause of the episode, but instead on its aftermath. After this, it is said the activist women were forced to create an independent women's suffrage movement. Stanton put this spin on it herself in later years. She said, quote, "We abandoned the counsels of men forever. Standing alone, we learned our power." Other explanations come down to personality. Stanton is said to have been elitist or aristocratic, but elitism doesn't necessarily yield this sort of racial slander. Others suggest that Stanton and Anthony were impressionable and fell under the influence of this man. This is George Francis Train, a notorious racist whom they met in 1867 in Kansas. A recent book by a historian who I respect very much says that Train, quote, "mysteriously and incredibly entranced Stanton and Anthony." I'm afraid that her language there is betraying the fact that she can't quite figure out how this was possible. So I don't think we've explained it yet. Perhaps most persistently, the women are described as naive, and the whole episode pathetically unnecessary because they were just crying for the moon. Women's suffrage was not at all really possible in Reconstruction. It was ahead of its time. That's a little phrase that always kind of goads me a little bit. I always wonder, well, what does that mean, you know? So I got drawn into thinking about this. And I finally concluded that they did have a chance, a slim but real fighting chance, I call it, to win women's suffrage in Reconstruction. And they weren't naive or impressionable. On the contrary, they were politically savvy, enough so that they would play the political game with decidedly unsavory allies if it got them what they wanted. They failed, and all they were left with was envy, bitterness, and their own record of selling out their principles. But the way to understand what they did is to understand the sequence of experiences that they went through. And the larger picture here is that I think the Civil War and Reconstruction amounted to an ordeal that changed people. Not only the soldiers, not only Southerners, many, many people in ways that we're still coming to understand. So let me start with the state of the women's movement on the eve of the Civil War. And here I want to turn to, there's something called social movement theory. I discovered this. Sociologists dreamed this up, and I think it's useful. Social movement theory says that there are three things that any movement for social change has to have if they're to have any chance of success. First thing, they have to have good arguments, arguments that appeal to what they call the prevailing discourse in a society. And I think they already had those arguments at Seneca Falls. That thing about we hold these truths to be self-evident, that's a powerful argument because it's not saying to people change your ideas, it's saying live up to the ideas that you already have. And it would still be a powerful argument when Martin Luther King included a version of that in his I Have a Dream speech, that one day America will live out the true meaning of its creed. So I think they had good arguments. The second thing that any social movement needs is resources. Of course, human resources, talented, energetic people willing to work hard, but material resources as well. Any social movement needs money. Money to print petitions, hire halls, pay postage, cover the expenses of activists. And it's true that most social movements are impecunious, but women's rights was particularly so because of the married women's property laws in those days. Married women, and that was 90% of all adult women, did not own property. Even the clothes on their backs belonged to their husbands. And so they weren't exactly able to contribute to causes that appealed to them because they didn't control property or purse strings. Now, historians have tended to overlook this particular factor, the money, preferring to focus on ideas or strategy. But I'm arguing that money is important, and I suppose we all know that when we think about contemporary examples of this. If you got a call tonight from an adult child who said, "Mom, Dad, I'm so concerned about global warming that I'm going to quit my job and work full-time to save the earth," what might you say? Something like, "What are you going to live on?" We would immediately go to the reality that activism costs money. So we need to look back and see that in the past, I think. Now, this resource problem, we said they had the first requisite, good arguments. Second, resources. The resource problem had been solved just before the Civil War, when the women's movement received bequests from two Boston abolitionists, this man, Francis Jackson, and this man, Charles Hovey. These were abolitionists who cared about a range of issues, and partly because of issues of sympathy with women and their own families. They were particularly sympathetic with women's rights as well. The largest chunk of money came from Hovey. He left $50,000, an enormous amount of money in those days, to campaign for abolition, women's rights, and a couple of other causes at the discretion of some trustees of the fund that he was going to set up. So they had a good chunk of money. And then there's the third necessity, political opportunity. The idea here is that social movements may seek to change hearts and minds, but sooner or later they have to institutionalize their goals by changing the laws and the policies. And for this, they need to seize political opportunity. Now, it's true that some activists are content to educate and agitate, assuming that if you change hearts and minds, sooner or later the laws will come along. But I think other activists are much more politically minded. They're watching and waiting for the moment when the political system might be open to radical change, which it normally isn't. It isn't open to outsiders. And so you have to watch for a moment when things are breaking open or askew in some way. That's difficult. It's particularly difficult because politically minded Radicals always walk a fine line between being irrelevant, powerless outsiders or co-opted, sold-out insiders. You want to think about getting something done in politics without getting sucked in, and that's hard to do. And moreover, this last thing, this political opportunity, is the hardest to achieve because activists can't really make it happen. You know, you can fine-tune your arguments, you can try to raise money, but you cannot force political opportunity. You don't have the power to change the existing political arrangements in quite that way. So before the war, Stanton and Anthony had looked to the state level. That's where I think they thought they could get their breakthroughs. Going after women's rights at one state, and it would be a bellwether and a model for others. And then they had the money to start, and they put up a campaign in New York State. They hired 6 women to lecture all over the state, pass petitions, lobby the legislature. They got legislation through, changing the married women's property laws and the custody laws. And then they looked around and said, well, now what next? Should we go after the vote? Trying to figure out if they had enough allies inside the New York State legislature. But then the Civil War intervened, and they suspended their efforts for women's rights. Instead, they saw the war as a chance to destroy slavery, something they had also been actively supporting for decades. As I'm sure you know, Lincoln at first resolved to restore the Union without touching slavery. But as Frederick Douglass put it, the inexorable logic of events would make that impossible. Susan B. Anthony described the war as a kind of glorious revolution, that emancipation will surely come out of it, she thought. And this man, this is the great abolitionist orator Wendell Phillips, probably next to William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous abolitionist of the day, and a good friend and ally of Stanton and Anthony. Wendell Phillips put it this way, he was predicting this. He said, quote, "The Republican Party have undertaken a problem, saving the Union, the solution of which will force them to our position, emancipation. In order to save the Union, they'll have to destroy slavery." And Stanton and Anthony hoped, in a similar fashion, that the nation was undertaking a problem, then, emancipation, the solution of which would force them to define the rights of free people. And that was a process from which women stood to gain greatly. So, Stanton and Anthony and other women activists put together something called the Women's Loyal National League. At the first meeting in 1863, they resolved, there can never be true peace in the Republic until the civil and political equality of every subject of the government shall be established. Every subject of the government, that would be black people, women, everybody. But their practical work was not about black rights or women's rights. Their practical work was simply and solely about ending slavery. Now remember, it was 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation had already been issued, but they could see that emancipation had to be safeguarded. A simple presidential proclamation wasn't going to be durable enough. They were going to need a constitutional amendment. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Lincoln. Have you seen this? Yes, yeah. If you haven't, do go see it. I'm always leery of movies with historical subjects, but this is a really good one. I have just one complaint, which I will register, but it's a marvelous movie. What the Women's Loyal National League did was petition for a constitutional amendment. And they rolled up over 400,000 signatures on petitions asking for that measure. And the impact of that petitioning is often taken for granted. In the movie, the 13th Amendment is, you'll recall, treated as a kind of inside job. It's all about white male politicians and what they will or won't do. But the only reason that Abraham Lincoln could be focused on the inside in early 1865 is that outside, public opinion had been thoroughly canvassed all across the North and aroused by means of this massive petition drive. So they had accomplished something important here, helped to accomplish something important. The women's rights activists put their shoulders to the political wheel on behalf of black freedom. So in the spring of 1865, they could see that the war was ending, they could see that slavery was dying, and now they wanted to turn to their own cause. And of course, then they had the arguments, they had the money, and now it was clear in the destruction that the war had wrought that political arrangements were wide open. In other words, it seemed that history had dealt them all the cards they needed, the arguments, the money, and now political opportunity. Well, a few weeks after Appomattox, anti-slavery radicals met at the annual meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, Garrison's old organization that he formed back in the 1830s. At that meeting, William Lloyd Garrison moved to disband. He said we should declare victory and put ourselves out of business. Mission accomplished. But Wendell Phillips and his allies, including black radicals like Frederick Douglass, argued forcefully that the organization should be kept going to fight for black rights, without which nominal freedom would be meaningless. There was a debate. Phillips carried the day, Garrison stalked out, and Wendell Phillips stepped forward to deliver his first speech, in effect setting the agenda, the post-war agenda for radicals. And what he said was, one question at a time, this is the Negroes' hour. This is the Negroes' hour. And he was going out of his way to say we're not going to do anything about women's rights. The only goal, he said, was to win the vote for black men. The advocates of women's suffrage were not only to give priority to black suffrage, but also to fall silent on their own issue, because Phillips was so sure, he said, that agitating for both causes at once would harm black men's chances. Stanton and Anthony, they'd known him for a long time, they respected his opinions, they hesitated. Stanton sent Phillips a starchy note saying, do you believe the African race is composed entirely of males? Finally, at the end of the year, they decided to go ahead and challenge Phillips. And they had an alternative strategy. His strategy was the Negroes' hour. Their strategy was claim the uttermost. Claim the uttermost. And Stanton quoted this man. This is Daniel O'Connell, who was the leader of the Irish nationalist cause in those days. And she had met O'Connell when she visited Europe. And she said to him something like, well, do you really expect to get Irish independence? You know, to throw off British rule is a pretty tall order. And he said, claim the uttermost and you're sure to get something. So, recalling this, she thought this is a pretty valid way to look at things. The idea was that agitating for both causes simultaneously wouldn't hurt, might even help black suffrage. Maybe women's suffrage could slip in somewhere in a state where it could act as a bellwether to others, but even if not, it wouldn't hurt to try. To do both at once, it won't hurt to try. Claim the uttermost. Well, Wendell Phillips was not persuaded. They went back and forth on this some. He would not change the goals of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and ultimately Stanton and Anthony had to create a whole new organization devoted to equal rights for all, without regard to race or sex, universal suffrage. They called it the American Equal Rights Association. Well, I put it to you, which strategy is the best one for activists? Should activists go after one thing at a time, or should they go big? I guess there's a consensus emerging here. I think if we think it over, you realize that there's no pat answer to this. It depends on the situation, and it is easy to imagine circumstances in which going big is a perfectly valid and effective strategy. In fact, when we teach women's history in colleges these days, we usually talk about the 1970s as a time when the extreme demands of the women's liberationists made the goals of the moderates from the National Organization for Women look reasonable by comparison, even though the now moderates were terribly worried that the women's libers were going to discredit the whole movement. Going big turned out to work. In 1866, Frederick Douglass apparently agreed with Stanton and Anthony. Later on, they were going to fight, but at the outset here, he agreed. I think this is true because he did not echo the mantra, the Negroes' hour. He gave a lot of speeches, and I think I've looked at everything. Maybe I've missed some things. It would be easy to use that phrase, but he never did. More decisive evidence comes from the fact that he became an officer in the AERA. He became vice president. And you can see him making his characteristic argument over and over again in this period. He will always say, of course, the black suffrage is the most important thing. But then he would go on to say how important and valid women's suffrage was. If he had been following the Negroes Hour, he wouldn't have continued speaking with that second point. That was not supposed to be mentioned. He didn't, I don't know whether he didn't think he should tell the women what to do, or he believed in the go big philosophy, but he certainly went along with it for a while at this time. Now, you'll recall that Charles Hovey left his money to abolition, women's rights, and so on. And Hovey's will specified that if chattel slavery was to be abolished, before the money was all gone, the balance should go to women's rights, pacifism, and free trade. Well, the 13th Amendment was a reality, so slavery was abolished. Free trade was espoused by plenty of mainstream politicians, and pacifism as a movement was pretty much moribund in the wake of what most people agreed had been a righteous war. So women's rights, the women's rights cause, clearly stood to be the prime legatee. However, the head trustee of the Hovey Fund was none other than Wendell Phillips. And when Phillips couldn't persuade Stanton and Anthony to defer voluntarily to his Negroes Hour strategy, he tried to compel them to do so by withholding money to which they were entitled. He would prevent them from campaigning for women's suffrage, no money for that. His argument was that slavery was not really abolished until black men had the vote. And he wouldn't even release Hovey money in any situation where the two causes were mixed. He was so sure that mixing them would harm black suffrage. So no money for women's suffrage and no money for the two at the same time. So Stanton and Anthony were looking at this extraordinary window of political opportunity, but they weren't going to be able to take advantage of it. It was in the state of Kansas in 1867 that this came strongly to bear. In early 1867, the Kansas state legislature put two referenda on the ballot for that fall, one for black suffrage and one for women's suffrage. Kansas, let's see here. Here's a view of Leavenworth, Kansas in 1867. It was pretty much of a frontier place in those days. And there's a map of Kansas in 1867. You can see that the whole western part of the state isn't even included. That was Indian country. So it was a frontier area. It recently settled. It seemed like a very good opportunity because Republicans outnumbered Democrats at almost 3-1 in Kansas. So the referenda could carry even with substantial roll-off among the party faithful. And I should stop here and point out that in those days, the Republican Party was the party of equal rights and progressive ideas. I'm sorry to have to make that point. The Kansas Republican Party was very large, but it was divided. There were a lot of old free soil radicals dating back to the days of Bleeding Kansas and John Brown before the war. But the Kansas Republican Party also included lots of men who were pretty conservative about principles. The only reason they had joined the Republican Party was because it was the only way that you could get a patronage job in the state of Kansas. And so they had made the best of it. These two factions had been held together by a charismatic party leader, a man named Jim Lane, but he had just recently committed suicide, and there was no leader at the top of this thing. No successor had emerged. So what the AERA wanted to do was to send speakers out to Kansas to campaign for both referenda and to bolster the radical faction of the party. Prospects seemed good. Kansas had a small electorate. Only about 30,000 votes were cast in 1867. So what we call the retail politics of speech and debate seemed like it could have really significant impact. You could really get around and talk to almost everybody. It was doable. And outside speakers were not going to be called carpetbaggers because virtually all the adults in the state, with the exception of the Native Americans, of course, had recently arrived from somewhere else. So it seemed like a tremendous opportunity, and Anthony wanted to send 10 or 12 experienced, charismatic public speakers to canvass the state to make the case for both black and women's suffrage. She was thinking of Anna Dickinson, Frederick Douglass, maybe Wendell Phillips himself. She thought this was quite a winnable proposition. But Wendell Phillips refused. No Hovey money in a mixed situation. He wasn't going to go personally, and he was not going to fund any such effort. Ultimately, the AERA scraped up enough donations to send only one speaker to Kansas. This woman, there's Lawrence, Kansas in that same year. There's Olympia Brown, is who they sent. Universalist minister from Massachusetts. Stepped away from her pulpit and went out to campaign. Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell had tested the waters in Kansas in the spring. Stanton and Anthony would go out to Kansas themselves in the fall. But the bulk of the campaign throughout that long, hot summer was Olympia Brown's work, soldiering on alone in Kansas, riding across the prairies from one little town to the next, giving at least one speech every day, sometimes two. She was meeting people, moving them, introducing subjects that they hadn't thought about, perhaps, because women's suffrage was a fairly new question. And then she began to face a campaign of organized opposition, a campaign of Republican opposition to women's suffrage, orchestrated principally by this man. His name was Charles Eskridge, and he had help from this man, the Reverend Isaac Calich. Neither of these fellows had any record of support for black suffrage, although each claimed to be supporting it now. Eskridge attacked women's suffrage in a barrage of slimy charges. He said that if women could vote, wives would become the common sexual property of all men. The legislative session in Topeka would degenerate into an orgy, this kind of thing. But he also claimed to be opposing women's suffrage out of concern to protect black suffrage. Meanwhile, however, he and the other conservatives never mounted any positive campaign for black voting rights. The local radicals tried to support both of these causes, both black and women's suffrage. But the Eskridgites made deliberate efforts to get up a quarrel between the two causes. They spread false reports in the papers, saying, for example, that black men had declared that women's suffrage was terrible, or that Olympia Brown had smeared black men as dirty and unworthy to vote. Olympia Brown and one of the local black leaders, a man named Reverend Twine, appeared jointly on stage in a show of mutual support. Brown told the audience the charges were untrue. But some supporters of women's rights, especially this man named Sam Wood, took the bait and expressed resentment of black men, and lent a little bit of credence to the charge that women's suffrage was somehow at odds with black suffrage, or even had perhaps been a ploy all along to undermine black suffrage. Well, by the end of the summer, the Eskridge and Calich faction had seized control of the party apparatus, with help from the state's largest newspaper, the Daily in Leavenworth. They played out this charade of we're supporting black suffrage by trashing women's suffrage. And the AERA never had the resources to counter these local dynamics. In that same year, Wendell Phillips did spend Hovey money to campaign for black suffrage, but that was in Ohio, where it didn't have to mix with women's suffrage. Not a penny for Kansas. In the upshot, both Kansas referenda went down to defeat, black suffrage losing by almost the same margin as women's suffrage. As the Eskridgite faction divvied up the patronage spoils among the usual suspects, all male, all white, all conservative, they put out their cover story. Women's suffrage advocates had defeated black suffrage by loading it down with a side issue. they failed to mention that they had not mounted any significant vote yes campaign for black suffrage. Now, it was a matter of common sense in those days. These days, political scientists will tell us this. You're not going to win a referendum unless you campaign on a vote yes. Political scientists say that voters' default position in referenda is no. You have to convince them of yes with a vote yes campaign, affirmative campaign, and it had not been done. Well, whose name have I not mentioned in explaining Kansas? George Francis Train was undoubtedly a racist. But he didn't arrive on the scene until late October, 2 weeks before Election Day. Too late to affect the outcome. What his presence did in those last 2 weeks was to muddy the waters. Phillips and other Eastern abolitionists couldn't get their minds around the complexities of this inter-party faction fight. And anyway, Phillips readily leapt to the conclusion that women's suffrage had undermined black suffrage because that was what he'd always assumed it would do. Stanton and Anthony were blamed for having killed black suffrage by bringing in the racist Train. Stanton and Anthony always believed that both causes could have won if they'd stuck together and had adequate resources. Sometimes they said, well, at least black suffrage could have won, but for the short-sightedness of Eastern allies who failed to support the effort. Stanton and Anthony were bitter at the loss of this irreplaceable opportunity in Kansas, and they were doubly bitter to be blamed for it. Phillips and a group of former abolitionists in the Boston area kept sniping at Stanton and Anthony for what they had done in Kansas. And then heading home from Kansas, they decided to do something else that they knew was sure to bring more criticism. They decided to take money from George Francis Train. They knew what he was, they knew his reputation. They talked about it as a deal with the devil. They said, well, we will make a deal with the devil. Well, why did they do that? They had no other resources. The Hovey money was withheld from them. The last of the Jackson money had gone in a court case when Jackson's son-in-law sued back in Boston. Their decision to take George Francis Train's money was the alternative to going home and folding their hands and occasionally writing a letter to the editor, something like that. They couldn't campaign without some money, and Train was going to offer it to them. So they decided to take it, despite his reputation. But he was sufficiently famous and flamboyant that his reputation obscured the real history of what had happened in Kansas. Now, 1867 was a historic turning point, political historians tell us, because the Republican Party was beginning to redefine itself. When black suffrage referenda went down to defeat that year in Kansas and also in some other states in the North, conservatives in the party seized on the results to hammer the radicals and shift the balance of power within the party. Not just this happened in Kansas, but it happened nationally as well. The party of Thaddeus Stevens, if you remember in the film, he's the character played by Tommy Lee Jones, the real radical among them. The party of Thaddeus Stevens was on its way to becoming the party of Roscoe Conkling, perhaps the most famous or notorious Republican in the Gilded Age, powerful, arrogant, and corrupt. Now, no one who understood politics as well as Stanton and Anthony could look back on Kansas without desperate regret. After Kansas, Stanton and Anthony used Train's money to start publishing their newspaper, The Revolution, but they still weren't quite ready to settle down and be journalists. You know, it's a certain kind of activism, but they were so intent on winning something somewhere. They were hoping to take advantage of this Reconstruction window of political opportunity, win women's suffrage somewhere, somehow. Their first hope lay in the thought that Andrew Johnson would be impeached because this man, Ben Wade, was next in line for the presidency. He was president pro tem of the Senate at that point. And Ben Wade supported women's suffrage. Well, as you know, Johnson was impeached by the House, but he was not removed by the Senate. The effort fell one vote short of the needed 2/3. So when that hope disappeared, they thought perhaps this man could carry the torch for them. This is Salmon P. Chase, and there was kind of a boomlet going for Salmon P. Chase as the Democratic nominee for president in 1868. And Chase supported universal suffrage. He was an old friend and acquaintance of these women. But Democrats were not interested in forgiving Chase for his excursion into the rival Republican Party. You remember, Chase was part of the team of rivals. He was in Lincoln's cabinet. So that wasn't going to work out either. Then they looked for allies with this man. This is William Silvis, who was putting together something called the National Labor Union. And there was talk of labor creating a third party, and it seemed like that would be a pretty powerful political move. But it wasn't going to happen right away. An alliance between labor and women's rights was a long-term project. And the clock was ticking here on this window of opportunity. Meanwhile, they were taking criticism about Train in Kansas. It was even suggested that Susan B. Anthony was dishonest about money in her Kansas accounts. One of the most unlikely people in the world to accuse of this. Train's financial support then also dried up. Train was a Fenian. He went to England. He spoke out about his opinions about Irish independence. The British threw him in jail. He refused to pay a fine that he considered unjust, so he spent a lot of 1868 in a British jail, and the money stopped. So it seemed the window of opportunity was closing. The newspaper was running deeper and deeper into debt every passing week. They couldn't keep this up much longer. In September 1868, Elizabeth Cady Stanton tried one last gambit and descended to the worst racism in an episode that has been up to now largely overlooked. On the front page of the Revolution, Stanton and Anthony sold out their black allies by endorsing this man. This is a man named Frank Blair. He was the 1868 Democratic nominee for vice president, running on the ticket with Horatio Seymour. There they are. They were running against Ulysses S. Grant and Schuyler Colfax. You'll remember that, Grant, the war hero, was carrying the torch for the Republicans. Now, Seymour and Blair were welcoming Southern Democrats back into the nation and the party, hoping to resurrect their party as the majority party, as it often had been before the war. And the deal involved Northern Democrats embracing white supremacy and Southern Democrats in turn renouncing secession. Seymour was a kind of inoffensive old milquetoast in this operation, but Blair was the one who provided the red meat for the Democratic Party, the thing that really got people going. Blair denounced radical Reconstruction as unconstitutional, but he took the campaign in a new direction with a major speech in September, insisting that the real problem with Reconstruction was that enfranchising black men was sure to unleash a despotism of bestial passions. There it is again, rape. Blair's speech was an early and high-profile expression of this deeply racist mythology of the myth of the black rapist. And I don't know that we've completely left it behind us, but it was very, very powerful in the late 19th century. It was the excuse for lynching in the South. However, in that same speech, that very same speech, in one line, Blair appeared to endorse women's suffrage. And so Stanton and Anthony endorsed Blair. This revolution endorsement was picked up by the New York World, which meant it was publicized all over the country, including in the South. The Georgia Weekly Telegraph, for example, Milledgeville, Georgia, doctored up a Stanton quote and told its readers that this northern woman urged patriots to unite, quote, in the great approaching struggle to elect Horatio Seymour and Frank Blair, that the war for the Union, the Constitution, and the laws may be commenced in earnest. Now, see, these are Southerners now wrapping themselves in the Union and the Constitution, but the war they were talking about was a campaign of terror being unleashed by Georgia Klansmen with the intention of intimidating black voters and thus stealing the 1868 election. So Stanton and Anthony literally gave aid and comfort to Georgia Klansmen. This is stomach-turning. This is the ticket here, kind of campaign material, and it really tells you all you need to know about the Seymour and Blair ticket. Our motto, this is a white man's country, and I've cut off the bottom. It says, let white men rule. This is a white man's country. This is what Stanton and Anthony had endorsed. It's despicable. How did they get there? Let's look back. The resentment of Phillips about the money had eventually begun to spill over from him to the black men whose cause he championed. By this point in 1868, Stanton and Anthony were bitter about the money. They were stung by unfair criticism, disappointed in their high hopes, fed up with erstwhile allies, exhausted physically, heavily in debt, and very much afraid that the Reconstruction window of opportunity was about to close. They were grasping at straws. I think they believed that Democrats might just win the 1868 presidential election. And if so, Blair and Seymour ought to be encouraged to follow through on women's suffrage, no matter how dirty their hands might be in other ways. And it is a fact that the Democrats succeeded in stealing the election in Georgia. And they used the same methods to win in Louisiana as well. If other southern states had done the same, the Democrats would have taken a long step toward retaking national power in that year, 1868. Well, these women sold out their principles, but of course Blair and Seymour lost. And Stanton then, in early 1869, went so far as to adopt Blair's black rapist line when she said that about fearful outrages if the 15th Amendment were passed, the quote I began the talk with. Now, according to the claim the uttermost strategy, at that point in early 1869, Stanton and Anthony should have been saying to themselves, well, we're not going to get the uttermost. We're going to have to settle for something. Remember, that was the idea, claim the uttermost, you're sure to get some. The something was going to be black suffrage. But they couldn't quite bring themselves to do it after all they'd been through. The 15th Amendment had been proposed, passed out of Congress. Frederick Douglass split with them at this point, because he could see that activists would be crazy not to take this bird in the hand from the Republican Party when it was offered, even though radicals like Douglass understood that the wording of the 15th Amendment was weak. There were loopholes, and it would be possible later on, as you know, for the white South to disenfranchise black men using proxy grounds for race, like literacy tests and poll taxes and so on. But nevertheless, actually, Charles Sumner, the great radical Republican from Massachusetts, refused to vote for the 15th Amendment. He thought it was too weak. But Douglass, political realist, said, this is what we've got, let's take it. And Stanton and Anthony couldn't bring themselves to admit he was right. In later years, Stanton and Anthony were probably embarrassed by this Blair endorsement, because it didn't show up in Stanton's autobiography, and wasn't in Anthony's authorized biography. And to cover it up, when they wrote their massive History of Women's Suffrage, this eventually went on to 6 volumes. You'd think they could mention everything in here, right? They covered it up by conflating the 14th and 15th Amendments and backdating the origins of the dispute over women's suffrage and black suffrage, because they wanted to tell a story in which they had, if not done the right thing, at least taken a defensible position, which their position on the 15th Amendment was not. They wanted to tell a story in which the sexism of men was the reason for the split. Recent historians have pointed the finger in the other direction, pointing to racism of these white women. But either way, I'm suggesting an essentialist explanation is not very satisfactory. Instead, I think we should look to how a set of events and circumstances and assumptions and decisions led step by step to an outcome that was contingent, not inevitable. I think the key to understanding the whole episode lies in Stanton and Anthony's belief that they actually had a fighting chance to win women's suffrage in the near term. And within the political disorder unleashed by the Civil War, that belief was not naive. Instead, it was rooted in a good deal of political insight and a strong sense of history. Stanton and Anthony came to a sorry pass by pursuing fleeting and finite political opportunities they believed, quite rightly, would never recur in their lifetime. Political opportunism, not naivete, drove them onward. If they hadn't believed they had a fighting chance, they wouldn't have stooped so low. And that belief made sense in the aftermath of the war, because when things that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier had become everyday reality, who could really say then what was ahead of its time? And so they disgraced themselves. Thank you. Glad to take questions.